He arrived at the edge of a starving camp, wearing a uniform meant for a war he had never commanded, claiming a rank he had never held, riding toward 12,000 men who would soon call him the reason they survived the winter that almost ended the American Revolution. His name on the papers read, Lieutenant General Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, late of the personal staff of Frederick the Great, one of the most decorated soldiers in the Prussian army. Almost none of it was true. He had never been a lieutenant general. He had never served on Frederick's personal staff in the way the letter implied. He had left the Prussian army years earlier, holding nothing more than the rank of captain. And by the time he set foot on American soil, in the final days of 1777, he was a nearly penniless former officer with mounting debts, a tarnished reputation, and no army left to serve in. And yet, within 4 months of walking into the frozen mud of Valley Forge, this man, with the invented title, would begin transforming the most poorly organized fighting force in the Western world into the army that would, within 3 years, stand toe-to-toe with the finest infantry in Europe and win. This is the story of how a fabrication became one of the most consequential deceptions in American history, and how the man behind it earned, in the end, every ounce of the reputation his forged papers had only pretended to describe. To understand why his lie worked, and why it mattered so profoundly, you first have to understand exactly what state the Continental Army was in the winter of 1777. By December of that year, General George Washington's forces had suffered a string of demoralizing defeats. Philadelphia, the seat of the fledgling American government, the very city where the Declaration of Independence had been signed just 18 months earlier, had fallen to the British. Washington's army had been pushed back at Brandywine, mauled at Germantown, and forced into retreat again and again by a professional, well-supplied, disciplined British military machine that had centuries of European warfare behind its doctrine. As the year drew to a close, Washington made the decision to march his exhausted, battered troops to a defensible plateau along the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania, a stretch of high ground surrounded by forest and water that offered natural protection from a British assault. It was called Valley Forge, and it would become, in the memory of the nation that was still fighting to be born, a symbol of suffering almost beyond description. Roughly 12,000 soldiers stumbled into that encampment in the days before Christmas. Many of them had no shoes. Eyewitnesses described trails of blood in the snow, left behind by men whose feet had been shredded by miles of marching without proper footwear. Uniforms, where they existed at all, were tattered, mismatched, and inadequate against the brutal Pennsylvania winter. Blankets were scarce. Food was scarcer still. The Continental Congress, hamstrung by a weak central government with no power to levy taxes directly, struggled to supply an army it could barely fund, and the quartermaster and commissary systems meant to move food and equipment to the troops were riddled with corruption, incompetence, and simple logistical collapse. Soldiers went days without bread. Horses starved and died in their harnesses. Disease tore through the camp with a cruelty that outpaced anything the British Army had managed to inflict in open battle. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia killed more men that winter than musket balls ever had. Estimates place the death toll at Valley Forge somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men, roughly a quarter of the force that had marched in. And they died not from combat, but from cold, hunger, and disease in the most agonizing and preventable ways imaginable. But the crisis at Valley Forge was not only a crisis of supply, it was a crisis of structure. The Continental Army, unlike the British force arrayed against it, had no standardized system of drill. Each state had raised and trained its own regiments independently, and each regiment had developed its own version of basic military maneuvers, its own commands, its own methods of loading a musket, its own way of forming a battle line. When units from different states were placed together on a battlefield, the result was often chaos. Soldiers did not know how to execute the same commands. Officers issued orders that meant one thing to a Massachusetts regiment and something entirely different to a Virginia one. The bayonet, one of the most fearsome weapons in 18th century warfare, was barely used by American troops at all. Many soldiers had never been properly trained to fix a bayonet in combat, and some, humiliatingly, Use them instead as cooking skewers or camp tools rather than instruments of war. There was no reliable system for moving troops from a marching column into a firing line quickly and without confusion, a maneuver that European armies had drilled into instinct, and that could mean the difference between an orderly advance and a slaughter. Discipline, in the formal military sense, barely existed. Officers and enlisted men often mixed freely in ways that undermined the chain of command. Sanitation in the camp was dangerously poor, contributing directly to the disease that was killing men by the hundreds. Washington understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that his army's problem was not courage. American soldiers had proven at Bunker Hill and elsewhere that they could fight with tremendous bravery. The problem was competence, cohesion, and training. The invisible architecture of a functioning military force that the British and their Hessian allies had inherited from generations of professional soldiering, and that the Americans, a nation of farmers and tradesmen only recently turned into an army, simply did not possess. What Washington needed was not more muskets or more men. He needed someone who understood, at the deepest level, how a European army actually functioned, someone who could take a mass of individually brave but collectively disorganized soldiers and forge them, in the most literal sense, into a unified fighting machine. He did not know that the man who would do exactly that was, at that very moment, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, carrying a resume built almost entirely out of exaggeration. The man's real story began decades earlier, and an ocean away, in the Kingdom of Prussia, a state whose entire identity had been built around its military. It was often said, with only a little exaggeration, that Prussia was not a country with an army, but an army with a country. At its head for much of the 18th century stood Frederick the Great, one of history's most celebrated military commanders, a king who personally drilled his troops and presided over an officer corps renowned across Europe for its precision and discipline. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben was born into this world in 1730 in the fortress town of Magdeburg, the son of a Prussian military engineer. He was exposed to the machinery of war almost from infancy. At 14, he watched his father direct the engineering work of a Prussian siege in Bohemia. By 16 or 17, he had enlisted in the Prussian army himself, and for the next 17 years, he lived the life of a Prussian officer during one of the most brutal conflicts in European history, the 7 Years' War. Steuben served with genuine distinction during that war. He was a second lieutenant when the conflict began in 1756, and he was wounded the following year at the Battle of Prague. He was wounded again 2 years later at the catastrophic Battle of Kunersdorf, one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war. He served as an adjutant, was taken prisoner by Russian forces at one point, and eventually rose to the rank of captain. In 1762, in what may have been the single most important credential of his entire career, he was selected as one of only 13 young officers chosen to receive special instruction directly from Frederick the Great himself, an extraordinary honor that placed him for a time genuinely within the orbit of Prussia's legendary king. It was real training, real exposure to the most sophisticated military doctrine in Europe, and it would prove immensely valuable later. But it was also, crucially, not the same thing as the career he would later claim to have had. When the war ended in 1763, the Prussian army was drastically reduced in size, and Steuben, like many officers, found himself abruptly unemployed, discharged at the rank of captain, with no war left to fight and no position waiting for him. The years that followed were a slow, grinding decline. Steuben took a position as a court chamberlain for a minor German prince, a job with a grand-sounding title but limited real influence. He accumulated the noble title of Freiherr, roughly equivalent to baron, through his connection to a duchess who was a niece of Frederick the Great, though even the legitimacy of this title has been debated by historians, some of whom argue his family had used the von designation for generations, while others suggest it was more recently acquired. He accompanied his prince on a fruitless trip to France in search of money, only to return to Germany deeply in debt, and in 1777, according to several accounts, he was forced to leave his position amid rumors of scandal, the precise nature of which remains murky in the historical record, but which left him, by his mid-40s, broke, unemployed, and with dwindling prospects in a Europe that had little use for a captain with no war to offer him. It was at this desperate juncture that Steuben made his way to Paris. hoping to find a position in some European army, any European army, that might restore his fortunes. He approached the British. He approached the Austrians. He approached the French. Every door closed. But Steuben had one advantage that would ultimately change the course of his life, and in a very real sense, the course of American history. Years earlier, in 1763, he had been introduced in Hamburg to a French officer named Claude Louis, Comte de Saint-Germain. By 1777, Saint-Germain had risen to become France's Minister of War. The two men crossed paths again in Paris, and Saint-Germain, recognizing in Steuben a rare asset, a man trained in the Prussian general staff system that neither the French nor the British possessed, introduced him to two men who were desperately searching Europe for exactly this kind of expertise: the American diplomats Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin. This is the moment where the fabrication begins, and it is worth pausing on it because it was not simply Steuben's own vanity at work. It was a deliberate, collaborative act of persuasion. The Continental Congress, burned repeatedly by European mercenaries and adventurers who arrived in America demanding high rank and lavish pay in exchange for dubious credentials, had grown deeply skeptical of foreign officers. Deane and Franklin understood that if they were going to convince Congress and Washington to take this particular former captain seriously, an honest resume would not be enough. So they wrote him a new one. In their letter of introduction to Washington, they described Steuben as a lieutenant general in the King of Prussia's service, a rank he had never held, and painted him as a man who had been intimately involved in the highest levels of Frederick the Great's military command. Steuben, for his part, embraced the fiction. He adopted the more elegant French rendering of his name, the Baron de Steuben, and allowed himself to be presented to the Americans as a former general and quartermaster general of the Prussian army, a fabrication so complete that by the time he crossed the Atlantic, the man boarding the ship bore almost no resemblance, on paper, to the actual captain who had left Prussian service 14 years earlier. He did not travel modestly, understanding that appearances mattered enormously in convincing skeptical Americans of his supposed rank. Steuben assembled an entourage befitting a general rather than an unemployed captain. He borrowed money from the French arms dealer and playwright Beaumarchais to fund the journey. He purchased horses and outfitted his small staff, which included several young French officers, a translator and secretary named Pierre-Étienne Duponceau, who was the only member of the party fluent in English, and even his own dog, a companion named Azor, who would become something of a camp mascot in America. In a detail that captures both the theater and the improvisation of the whole enterprise, Steuben's party dressed themselves in brilliant scarlet uniforms, having been mistakenly informed that this was the color worn by Continental Army soldiers. It was not. Scarlet was the color of the British Army, and upon arriving in New England, Steuben and his companions were nearly arrested by suspicious American militia, who assumed, quite reasonably, that a group of foreigners in red coats were enemy soldiers rather than volunteers coming to help. It was an almost absurd beginning to what would become one of the most consequential military partnerships of the entire war. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, now would be a great moment to hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next, because the real transformation is only just beginning. After the confusion in New England was sorted out, Steuben and his party were treated to lavish entertainment in Boston, a city eager to celebrate the arrival of what it believed to be a genuine European general, come to aid the American cause. From there, the group made their way toward York, Pennsylvania, where the Continental Congress had relocated after the British capture of Philadelphia had driven them from their original seat of government. Steuben arrived in York in early February of 1778 and met with Congress directly. True to the offer that had been extended by Deane and Franklin, and mindful of Congress's determination not to be burdened with yet another highly paid foreign mercenary, an arrangement was made. Steuben would not receive a fixed salary or guaranteed rank up front. Instead, he would serve initially as a volunteer, with the understanding that his compensation and formal position would be determined later, based on the value of the contributions he actually made. It was, in effect, a wager. Congress would not simply take his word, or the word of his forged introduction. He would have to prove it. On February 23, 1778, Baron von Steuben rode into the winter encampment at Valley Forge and reported to General Washington. The image that greeted him has been described by multiple soldiers who witnessed his arrival, and their accounts converge on a striking impression. One young soldier later wrote that his first sight of the Baron reminded him of the ancient god of war himself, that Steuben, with his imposing size, his elaborately trapped horse, his enormous pistol holsters, and his strikingly martial bearing, seemed the perfect personification of Mars. Whatever the truth of his actual rank, Steuben looked, in that moment, exactly like the general everyone had been told to expect. Washington, for his part, appointed him temporary inspector general, a position that would allow him to observe the state of the Army, its equipment, its discipline, and its living conditions, without yet committing Congress to the formal, permanent rank that Steuben's fabricated credentials implied he deserved. What Steuben found appalled him. He walked the camp extensively in those first days, moving among the huts and the shivering men, communicating largely through interpreters since his own English remained extremely limited. He later remarked to an aide that no European army could possibly have been held together under conditions as dreadful as what he witnessed at Valley Forge, and coming from a man who had lived through the 7 Years' War, this was not an idle comment. He saw regiments with no consistent method of loading a musket. He saw men who did not know how to execute the same basic marching commands as soldiers from a neighboring state's regiment. He saw sanitation so poor it was actively fueling the spread of disease through the camp. And yet, remarkably, what struck Steuben was not only the deficiency of the army, but its underlying resilience, the fact that these men, starving and freezing and undertrained as they were, had not simply dissolved. There was something there, he seems to have concluded, worth building on. Washington gave him the assignment almost immediately, and there was no time to waste on elaborate planning. Steuben had to improvise a training program on the spot, working with an army that could not afford months of gradual instruction. His solution was to begin small and build outward. He selected roughly 150 hand-picked veteran soldiers to form what he called a model company, and he began personally drilling them himself, an almost unheard-of act for a man of his supposed rank. A lieutenant general kneeling in the mud alongside common soldiers to demonstrate, step by step, the correct way to load a musket or execute a turn. His method blended the rigid precision of Prussian drill with adaptations drawn from French military practice. But perhaps his most important innovation was one born of necessity rather than doctrine. Because he could not speak English fluently, and because he could not personally train an entire army of thousands, Steuben trained his model company to an exacting standard and then had them fan out across the camp to become instructors themselves, teaching the same drills to their own regiments. It was, in effect, a multiplying system, and it meant that within a matter of weeks, standardized drill was spreading through Valley Forge at a pace that would have been impossible under any single instructor working alone. Steuben's personality became almost as legendary as his methods. He was famous, even in his own time, for his explosive temper on the drill field, cursing at soldiers in a chaotic blend of German, French, and broken English when they failed to execute a maneuver correctly, so thoroughly and colorfully profane that his aides reportedly had to step in and translate his curses into something resembling coherent, if still furious, instruction. But this temper was balanced by something the soldiers of Valley Forge had rarely encountered in an officer of supposedly aristocratic European rank: genuine warmth and personal investment in their well-being. Unlike many officers who maintained a rigid social distance from enlisted men, Steuben moved among the ranks, took a personal interest in ordinary soldiers, and treated the men under his instruction with something closer to camaraderie than command. Historians who have studied his methods note that Steuben grasped an important truth about the Continental Army faster than almost any other European observer. American soldiers, largely drawn from communities without deep traditions of aristocratic deference, did not respond well to discipline enforced purely through fear and hierarchy. They responded to leaders who earned their respect. Steuben adapted his Prussian training to this reality rather than imposing it rigidly. And it was precisely this flexibility that made his system work where a more rigid European approach might have failed entirely. Beyond drill itself, Steuben addressed problems that had nothing to do with marching formations, but everything to do with the Army's ability to function. He was appalled by the waste and outright corruption he found in the Army's supply and administrative systems, and he pushed for reforms that helped preserve desperately needed resources, tightening the chaotic distribution of food, equipment, and material that had been bleeding away through mismanagement even as soldiers starved. He introduced standardized camp sanitation procedures, addressing directly one of the underlying causes of the disease that had killed so many of his fellow soldiers that winter. and he began the enormous task of writing down, in a single unified document, the entire system of drill, tactics, and Army administration he was teaching, something the Continental Army had never possessed. One authoritative manual that every regiment, regardless of which state had raised it, could follow identically. The results began to show with startling speed. Soldiers who had marched into Valley Forge in December as little more than a disorganized collection of armed farmers were, within 2 months, executing coordinated maneuvers with a precision that visibly impressed observers. The introduction of proper bayonet training in particular would prove to have enormous consequences, teaching American soldiers to use a weapon that had previously been almost entirely neglected, one that would become crucial in the close engagements still to come. By the time spring arrived and the worst of the winter's suffering had passed, something had visibly changed in the character of the Army, encamped along the Schuylkill. It was no longer merely a survivor of catastrophe. It was beginning, for the first time, to resemble a professional fighting force. Washington took notice, and so, eventually, did Congress. As the reforms bore visible fruit and reports of Steuben's transformative effect on the Army reached the Capitol, Congress, acting on Washington's own recommendation, formally commissioned him in May of 1778 to the position of Inspector General with the rank of Major General, a genuine rank, earned this time not through fabricated paperwork, but through demonstrated results on the actual ground of Valley Forge. The lie that had gotten him through the door had, in a matter of months, been rendered almost beside the point. He no longer needed the fiction of a lieutenant generalcy from a war he had barely fought. He had earned an American major generalcy through work that Congress and Washington had watched unfold with their own eyes. If this kind of transformation, from a desperate deception to a genuinely earned reputation, is the kind of history that fascinates you, drop a comment below telling me what surprised you most, and consider subscribing if you want more stories like this one. The true test of Steuben's work came not in the drill field, but on the battlefield, and it arrived remarkably quickly. On June 19, 1778, exactly 6 months to the day after the Army had first marched into Valley Forge in defeat and desperation, the Continental Army marched back out, no longer the broken force that had staggered in the previous December. 9 days later, on June 28th, they engaged British forces at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. It was, in strictly tactical terms, an inconclusive engagement, with the British ultimately continuing their withdrawal toward New York, and neither side achieving a decisive victory. But inconclusive was, in itself, a kind of revolution. For the first time in the war, American Continental soldiers stood their ground against British regulars in open field combat, executing coordinated maneuvers, holding formation under pressure, and fighting with a level of discipline that would have been simply unthinkable for the same army only 6 months earlier. Officers who had served through the disorganized retreats of the previous year were stunned by what they witnessed. The transformation that had taken place in the mud and cold of Valley Forge was no longer theoretical. It had just been tested against the best infantry in the world, and it had held. Steuben's contributions did not end with Monmouth, though his path through the remainder of the war was neither smooth nor without controversy. In the winter that followed, he turned his attention to formalizing everything he had taught, drafting what would become known as Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, a comprehensive manual covering every aspect of running a military organization, from basic drill commands and the proper handling of arms, to camp administration, medical care for the sick, and the specific duties owed by every rank in the chain of command, from a regimental colonel down to the newest private. Because of the blue cover under which it was eventually printed, it became known informally as the Blue Book, and when Congress formally approved its publication in March of 1779, it became the first official drill manual ever issued by the United States Army, a document so thorough and so well suited to the particular character of American soldiers that it would remain in official use for more than 3 decades, and its influence on American military doctrine would echo for generations beyond that. Steuben's later service was not without setbacks, and honesty about his story requires acknowledging them rather than smoothing them away into pure triumph. He desperately wanted field command, the chance to lead troops in battle rather than simply train them, and Washington eventually granted him that opportunity, sending him south in 1780 to serve under General Nathaniel Greene's Southern Army. Circumstances redirected him instead to Virginia, where British forces under the traitor Benedict Arnold had launched an invasion. And it was here that Steuben's record grew genuinely mixed. He struggled badly in dealing with Virginia's often uncooperative local militia leadership, and his performance as an independent field commander proved